All right, let's dive right into another deep dive. This time we're tackling something that's been making waves in India. One nation, one election. Or, as you'll hear a lot today, O-N-O-E for short.
I think it's safe to say there are a lot of opinions on this one. Strong opinions.
That's the point. So today, we're not here to tell you what to think.
Right.
But we do want to give you all the info you need to, well, form your own opinion.
Informed opinion.
Exactly. And we've got a great lineup of sources for this. We're looking at an article from the Economic Times, some serious analysis from Drishti IAS, even a research paper, which is fun, from the International Journal of Advanced Academic Research.
Yeah, we did our homework on this one.
So buckle up. This is going to be a fascinating ride.
One of the things that I think is really interesting is that the idea of holding the Lok Sabha and the state assembly elections together
At the same time.
At the same time isn't actually like a brand new thing.
Right.
India actually did this from 1951 to 1967.
It's like a political blast from the past.
Yeah.
So what happened? Why did we move away from simultaneous elections?
Things got a little messy. There were a bunch of state assemblies that got dissolved before their terms were up, some Lok Sabha terms that, ended prematurely. Mm-hmm. And so that disrupted the whole, synchronized cycle.
So it kind of fell apart like a house of cards.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. But now there's this renewed push for this O&E, right?
Yeah.
And one of the biggest arguments you hear in favor of it is, well, the potential cost savings.
Yeah.
Because just the 2019 Lok Sabha elections alone cost a mind-blowing 60,000 crore rupees.
That's a lot of money. That's like bigger than the entire annual budget of a lot of countries, to give you an idea of the scale of that.
So yeah, you can definitely save a lot of money in terms of manpower, logistics, all that.
Yeah.
But okay, so less money on elections, that's a plus.
Yeah.
But some people worry that if elections happen less often, that politicians might become less accountable. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's a valid concern for sure. One of the cornerstones of any democracy is that citizens can hold their elected officials accountable, right?
Right.
And so some of the critics are saying, look, if you have these synchronized elections, that might kind of weaken that feedback loop.
Interesting.
The proponents, on the other hand, are saying, well, maybe this will shift the focus from constant campaigning to actually more like a long-term governance mindset.
Right. So instead of always thinking about the next election, you can actually focus on governing.
Yeah.
Interesting. But what about just like the impact on everyday life? It feels like in India, we're always in election mode.
Oh, yeah. Constantly. And I think this brings us to something called the Model Code of Conduct.
Oh.
A lot of folks might not be familiar with that. So basically, before every election, this set of rules kicks in that essentially says, look, the government can't make any major policy announcements or, really any decisions that could be seen as like trying to sway the voters.
So it's like a political timeout period?
Exactly. And while that's happening, it can totally disrupt any governance continuity. So you can imagine, some massive infrastructure project and it just stalls.
Right.
Because an election's around the corner.
Right. Right. And I remember, like, when I was in school, our classes would be constantly disrupted because they'd use the school as a polling station.
Oh, yeah, all the time. Schools, colleges, they'd be pulling teachers in to do election duty. So, yeah, I mean, simultaneous elections would definitely help minimize all of that.
Fewer disruptions. That's another point in favor.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the idea that maybe, just maybe, it could even boost voter turnout.
Possibly, yeah.
Do you think people would be more likely to vote if it was like a one and done situation?
I mean, some people are saying it might. Some of the research suggests that if you hold all the elections at once, it could actually increase participation. I mean, it's worth thinking about, right?
Yeah.
Would you be more likely to vote if you only had to go out once and, that was it?
It would be less daunting, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got cost savings, fewer disruptions, maybe even more people voting. But I've also heard this argument that this O&E could actually be good for the economy. Is there any truth to that?
So there's this committee led by former President Ramnath Kovind, and they actually suggested that this could boost India's GDP growth by 1.5%, which is a pretty big deal.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and their thinking is that fewer elections would mean a more stable political environment, and that would encourage long-term investment.
So businesses feel more confident about investing in India.
Yeah. If you know that the political landscape is stable, the policies are going to be consistent, you're more likely to put down roots.
Right. And it kind of sends a signal that, like, India is open for business, and we're in it for the long haul.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But, it's important to remember these are projections.
Right.
Not guarantees.
Of course. Okay, so we've talked about some of the good stuff, some of the potential advantages, but let's flip the coin. What about some of the challenges and concerns with this whole ONOE thing?
I think one of the biggest hurdles right out of the gate is the Indian Constitution.
Yeah. Oh.
To actually do one nation, one election, you'd have to amend multiple articles.
Okay, hold on. For folks who maybe aren't super familiar with the Indian Constitution, can you explain what a constitutional amendment even is and why is it such a big deal?
So think of the Constitution as like the rule book for how India is governed.
Yeah.
It lays out all the powers of the government, the rights of the citizens, the basic structure of, our democracy. So changing that's a super serious process. You need a supermajority vote in parliament to make that happen.
So it's not something you just do lightly.
No. And there are definitely folks out there who are saying, maybe messing with the Constitution just for, making elections more efficient, maybe that's not the best idea.
Right. Okay, so that's one hurdle. What else?
And then, logistically speaking, oh my gosh, can you imagine organizing elections for over 1 billion people all at once?
Yeah, that's hard to even picture.
Polling stations, personnel, security, transport, it's mind-blowing.
It's like trying to organize the world's biggest synchronized dance performance, but with 1 billion people across the whole country.
Wow. Exactly. It's like, how many electronic voting machines would you even need? And then training all those polling officials and, making sure that elections are free and fair across such a huge, diverse country.
It's an insane logistical puzzle.
It is.
Okay, so we've got the Constitution, we've got logistics. What else? What other concerns are people raising about this?
I think the big one is the impact this could have on federalism. India is a federal republic, right?
Right.
Which means that power is shared between the central government and the individual states.
Right.
So the question is, could this whole one nation, one election thing somehow diminish the power of those individual states?
That's a big one. What are your initial thoughts on that?
Well, it's definitely a debate that goes to the heart of how India is structured. Some people are saying, no, it won't undermine federalism at all, but then others are really worried about that shift in the balance of power. And so I think it would require really, really careful thought and safeguards to make sure that, each state still has its autonomy and its own distinct political dynamics.
So it's like we can't let this drive for efficiency end up sort of bulldozing over the whole idea of federalism and decentralization.
Exactly.
And then, okay, what happens if, a state government collapses before its term is up?
Yeah, what do you do then?
Do we just wait years until the next synchronized election?
The Drishti analysis actually has a couple of different solutions for that. They talk about maybe extending the remaining term or doing a fresh election just for that original term length.
Oh, interesting.
But as you can imagine, each option comes with its own, pluses and minuses. It's complicated.
It's like a political chess game.
Yeah.
Every move has these ripple effects.
Right. And that's the thing. This whole ONOE thing isn't just about saving money or, making elections easier. It's about navigating all these political, legal, logistical issues.
Right.
And making sure that we don't accidentally mess with the core principles of our democracy.
This is getting really interesting. I can definitely see why this is such a hot topic.
Oh, yeah. And we're just getting started. There's a lot more to unpack here.
Well, we'll have to continue this deep dive in our next segment then.
Welcome back. Before we jump into anything else, I want to kind of circle back to something we talked about earlier. That whole historical context of simultaneous elections in India.
Yeah, good point. It's easy to forget this isn't a brand new idea. India actually did have synchronized elections for quite a while after independence, right?
From 1951 to 1967. And I think it's important to understand why that system eventually kind of fell apart.
Yeah.
If we're trying to figure out if this ONOE thing could actually work in today's world.
Okay, history lesson time. Why did simultaneous elections go off the rails back then? Was it just like a few messy political situations?
It was a few things, but that Economic Times article we have, it points to a bunch of assembly dissolutions that happened early and then some Lok Sabha terms that didn't run their full course. So basically the whole election cycle got disrupted and then it just kind of had this domino effect. One assembly goes down early, then another, and pretty soon the whole synchronization is totally out of whack.
It's like a dance routine. where people start dropping out or missing their cues. The whole performance just falls apart.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of brings us back to one of the big concerns with O&E, right? Like, what if a state government collapses before its term is up?
Right.
Do we just sit around and wait years for the next synchronized election?
That seems like a recipe for, instability. Like, imagine a broken traffic light at a busy intersection. You need something to manage the flow, or it's just chaos.
Exactly. And that's why a lot of the folks who support O&OE, they say, look, we need clear rules in the Constitution to handle these kinds of things, like a well-defined plan for what happens if this happens, what happens if that happens.
Makes sense. I'm also curious about that argument that simultaneous elections could actually reduce accountability.
Yeah.
Like, if elections happen less often, does that give politicians more room to, stray from their promises?
It's definitely a concern that a lot of people have brought up.
Right. It's like out of sight, out of mind.
The argument on the other side is that, well, maybe the focus would shift away from constantly campaigning to actually governing for the long term.
So instead of always looking over their shoulder, politicians could actually, deliver on those promises, focus on those policies. But wouldn't that depend on, the politicians themselves?
Of course.
Are we just assuming that they'll magically become more responsible?
You're right. It's not a guarantee. It really comes down to the political culture and whether individual politicians are committed to, doing the right thing.
So it's a bit of a gamble then.
Yeah.
Like betting on the hope that fewer elections will lead to better governance.
It would definitely require a big shift in how people think about politics.
All right. Okay, I think it's time to zoom out a little. Look at what's happening globally. We talked a bit about this before, but I want to hear more about those countries that have actually made synchronized elections work.
Yeah, good idea.
Are there any lessons we can learn from them? Like things we could apply to India?
Absolutely. And, it's true that a lot of these countries with synchronized elections they're smaller than India.
Right.
Less diverse.
Right.
But there's still some really valuable things we can learn from them.
Okay, so who's doing this well? And what are some of those key takeaways?
Well, one that comes to mind is Sweden. They've been doing synchronized elections at the national and local levels for, ages. And it seems to be running pretty smoothly.
Interesting. What's their secret?
Well, one thing is that they have this long history of consensus-based politics. Like, political parties, even if they disagree on things, they're generally willing to, work together to find solutions.
So it's not just the rules of the election system itself, it's also the whole political culture, that willingness to collaborate.
Exactly.
It's like a really good orchestra, everyone knows their part, and they all work together to create this beautiful music.
I like that.
But that's something we'd really need to think about in India, right?
Oh, yeah.
Getting everyone on board for this O&OE thing would require a lot of consensus, which honestly could be tough given, the way things are right now.
It would be a huge challenge.
I feel like trying to get a room full of toddlers to agree on what game to play.
Yeah.
But seriously, if everyone's constantly fighting, it's hard to imagine this kind of big change even getting off the ground.
You're right. And it's not just about agreeing in principle either. You have to make sure the system protects everyone, the smaller parties, the regional interests, all of that.
Right. It's all about balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
Efficiency is important, but not at the expense of fairness. It's like building a super fast train, but you also got to make sure it doesn't go off the rails.
Exactly. You got to make sure it's stable. You got to make sure it's robust.
Okay, so Sweden. Any other countries doing this well?
South Africa is another interesting one. They started doing simultaneous elections after apartheid ended, and it's mostly been seen as a success. One of the key takeaways from them is the importance of having a strong, independent election commission, like someone to oversee the whole process.
Right, so it's not just about the rules on paper, it's about having someone you trust to make sure those rules are being followed.
Exactly, and that brings us back to that whole idea of transparency and accountability, right?
Right.
If we're going to do this O&OE thing in India, we need a system that people trust. A system that's fair, that's transparent. It's like when you go to a restaurant and they have that open kitchen where you can see everything that's going on.
I love that analogy. They're not hiding anything. Okay, Sweden, South Africa, any others?
Well, Australia has an interesting system. It's kind of a hybrid. They do synchronized elections for the federal government and some of the states, but not all of them. And I think their experience really shows how hard it is to do O&OE in a federal system where the states have a lot of power.
Right. Trying to force a one-size-fits-all solution on a system that's all about diversity it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
It's like, again, trying to fit those square pegs into round holes.
Exactly. But it does raise the question, could India maybe do a phased approach?
Like Australia.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of experts have suggested that, including that Coven committee we talked about. They said maybe start by synchronizing the Lok Sabha and assembly elections and then, see how it goes, learn from it. And then maybe think about expanding to other levels of government, like local elections.
So it's more of a cautious approach.
It is.
Like dipping your toes in the water before you jump in the pool.
Exactly. You test the waters, make sure everything's working okay, and then you can think about scaling things up.
Makes sense. It's about being smart and making data-driven decisions, rather than rushing into something that could backfire.
Absolutely. And whatever we do, we have to make sure it protects those core principles of Indian democracy, right? Federalism, separation of powers, judicial independence, all of that.
It's about evolving, not making a revolution.
I like that. It's about making our democracy better, but not throwing out the things that make it strong.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the history, the pros and cons, the global perspective. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And I think it's clear that this one nation, one election thing is, it's complicated.
It is.
There's no easy answer. There are good arguments on both sides.
Right.
And in the end, the decision of whether or not to do it is a political one.
But I think the most important thing is that we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
That people are, thinking about these issues, really engaging with them, thinking about what's best for Indian democracy.
I completely agree. The more informed people are, the better.
So what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they, kind of mull over this whole ONOE thing?
I think the most important thing is to be open-minded. Listen to different perspectives. There's not one right answer here. It's about weighing those pros and cons, understanding how complex this is, and then, forming your own opinion.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to talk about it with people who might see things differently. Those conversations, those debates, that's how we figure this stuff out together.
That's how we make our democracy stronger.
Okay, folks, that's a wrap on our deep dive into one nation, one election. We hope you learned a lot and that this sparked some interesting thoughts.
And if you want to keep the conversation going, you know where to find us.
Welcome back for the final stretch of our One Nation, One Election deep dive. We've covered a ton of ground already. The history, the potential upsides and downsides, those tricky constitutional questions.
Definitely a lot to consider.
Now it's time to widen the lens a bit, see what we can learn from other countries that have actually tried this whole synchronized election thing.
Always a good idea to peek over the fence and see what the neighbors are doing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into that, I think a quick reality check is in order. We touched on this earlier, but a lot of the countries that do synchronized elections, they're a lot smaller than India, a lot less diverse. So can we really compare? Is it apples to oranges?
That's a fair point. We have to be careful about just assuming what works in one place will magically work somewhere else. It's like thinking, oh, this plant grows great in a rainforest, so it'll do fine in the desert too. You have to think about the whole environment.
Right, the whole context. So with that in mind, who is doing this well? And what are some of the things we could learn from them, maybe apply to India?
Well, Sweden's a good example. They've been synchronizing their elections, national and local, for decades now. Seems to be going pretty smoothly for them.
Interesting. What's their secret?
Well, one thing is that they have this culture of consensus-based politics. Like, even if parties have different ideas, they're usually willing to work together, try to find solutions that everyone can live with.
So it's not just the rules, it's the whole attitude, right?
Yeah.
That willingness to collaborate. It's like, a well-rehearsed orchestra, everyone playing their part to make this beautiful music together.
I like that analogy.
But that's something we'd really need to think about in India, right? Because to pull off ONOE, you'd need a ton of buy-in from everyone, which, let's be real, could be a tall order in our current political climate.
Oh, for sure.
It's like trying to get a room full of, 5-year-olds to agree on what game to play.
Yes.
But seriously, if everyone's constantly fighting, it's hard to see how you'd even get started with such a big change.
It would take a lot of work, a lot of trust.
Okay, so Sweden.
Uh-huh.
Anyone else doing this well? Yeah.
South Africa is another good one. They started synchronizing their elections after apartheid, and for the most part, people see it as a success story. One of the things they emphasize is having a really strong independent election commission, like someone to oversee everything and make sure it's fair.
So it's not just about having the right rules on paper, it's about having a referee you can trust to enforce those rules.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that theme of transparency and accountability.
Right.
We've talked about this a lot, but it's really key. If India wants to go down this Ono-y path, we need a system that people believe in, that they know is fair and transparent. It's like, imagine going to a restaurant where the kitchen is completely open. You can see everything they're doing.
I love that. No secrets.
Right.
Okay, so Sweden, South Africa.
Yeah.
Any other examples worth mentioning?
Australia's system is kind of interesting. It's a mix and match approach. They synchronize some elections, like federal in some states, but not all of them. And I think their experience really highlights how hard it is to do Ono-y in a system where the states have a lot of autonomy, like in a federal setup.
Right, because you can't just force everyone to do things the same way, especially in a country like India with so much diversity. Like we've been saying, it's those square pegs and round holes again.
Exactly. But their example does make you wonder if India could maybe go for a more gradual, phased-in approach.
Like Australia.
Yeah, start with some, see how it goes, then maybe expand later. And actually, the Coven Committee suggested something similar, remember them?
Right.
They said maybe start by synchronizing Lok Sabha and assembly elections, and then, based on how that goes, maybe think about adding other levels of government, like local elections.
So, a more cautious approach.
Yeah.
Dip your toes in the water before you cannonball into the pool.
That's a good way to put it. You test things out, you make adjustments, and you make sure it's working before you go all in.
Smart. It's about being practical and, using data to make decisions.
Definitely. And it's also super important to make sure that whatever changes we make, they don't mess with the foundations of Indian democracy.
Right. Things like federalism, the separation of powers, the courts being independent.
Exactly. It's about making our democracy better, but not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's about evolution, not revolution.
I like that.
We've covered a lot of ground, that's for sure.
We have. From history to global examples, legal stuff, logistical nightmares, it's been quite the journey.
It has, and I think it's pretty clear that this whole one nation, one election thing is, well, it's complicated. There are good points on both sides, and ultimately it's a political decision.
Right, but the important thing is that we're talking about it, that people are thinking about it, learning about it, debating it. That's what the healthy democracy is all about.
Couldn't agree more. The more informed people are, the stronger our democracy is.
So as we wrap up, what's the one thing you want listeners to take away from all of this?
Be open-minded. Don't just listen to people you agree with. Really try to understand both sides.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer here. It's about figuring out what you think based on all the information.
And talk about it. Have those conversations, even if they get a little heated sometimes. That's how we learn. That's how we grow.
Exactly. Those conversations, that's how we make our democracy better.
Okay, folks, that's it for our deep dive into One Nation, One Election. We hope you enjoyed it, learned something new, and maybe even got a little fired up about this whole thing.
Keep those conversations going. And until next time, stay curious.